Kennedy declares a blockade, which is also an act of war, but he calls it a quarantine in order to make it seem a little more palatable.
More than 230 American warships spread out along the sea lanes into Cuba, awaiting the Soviet response. It will become one of the most famous moments of the Cold War. But it wasn't until 1992 that we found out the official version wasn't the whole story.
The Soviet ships are heading toward the quarantine line. A sub accompanying some of those ships is spotted by the American cruisers and destroyers.
The American ships start dropping special depth charges about the size of grenades.
The Soviets think that the United States is trying to sink them. But this is the beginning of the war. Why else would we be attacking a military vessel? They didn't realize that our protocol for a destroyer to make a subsurface is to drop sort of mock depth charges on it. Not trying to kill it, but to signal to it in a very rough way that they should surface.
We now know that was almost a fatal mistake.
The Americans had no idea that they had nuclear weapons on board.
Or that the sub's 3 senior officers had the authority to launch those nukes. But only if the decision was unanimous.
The Soviet commander gives the order to launch the nuclear torpedo.
One of the other high-ranking officers says, okay, that sounds good. And then the last high-ranking officer, a guy named Arkhipov, says, no, we're not going to do that. I will not approve of that. That's how close it comes. One vote, one person.
Another of the Cold War's biggest what-ifs.
Had that happened, they would have taken out the U.S. fleet. The U.S. would have definitely taken out Cuba, but very likely would have taken out the Soviet Union.
That wasn't the only near miss we didn't know about. Aerial reconnaissance had brought back evidence of missile site preparation in Cuba. If operational, they could strike almost anywhere in the United States. In response, American military leaders urged Kennedy to authorize an attack on mainland Cuba.
The military leaders want to bomb the missile sites and invade and overthrow the Cuban government. Kennedy resists.
In the days that follow, an American U-2 spy plane is shot down, and U.S. troops are ready for invasion. After a 13-day standoff, Kennedy and Khrushchev strike a deal. It's over. The Soviets pack up their nukes and go home. History records it as President Kennedy's finest hour. The day he stood up to the Soviets, kept nukes out of Cuba, and saved the world. But as so often in the atomic age, declassified secrets tell a very different story.
The biggest myth of the Cuban Missile Crisis that was common for decades and decades is that the United States stopped the Soviet Union from putting nuclear weapons on Cuba. It was not until the 1990s that we found out that we had not stopped them, that there were already nuclear weapons on the island.
Smaller, short-range tactical nuclear missiles, battlefield nukes.
There were several operational missiles already ready to go that would have been used if the United States had attempted a military invasion of Cuba.
McNamara, when he heard that, he turned white.
Because as Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara knows how close America came to invading Cuba.
But if we had actually done that, we would have certainly gotten into at least a limited nuclear war, and that easily could have sped out of control into a much larger nuclear war.
Those 13 days in October brought us even closer than we ever thought to nuclear war. What we didn't know almost killed us.
The Cuban Missile Crisis was a great example of how a hair-trigger decision by a submarine captain or a battery defense unit on the island of Cuba could have precipitated a full-out conflict, potentially with a nuclear exchange, which, thank God, never happened.